Why did StuG crews suffer casualty rates as high as 80% in World War II? How did a vehicle that was never even designed to fight tanks end up becoming the biggest tank killer of the war, with more kills than the famous Panthers and Tigers combined? And why, despite being the most produced German tracked armored fighting vehicle, with over 10,000 units built, were only a little over 1,000 still operational by the final months of the war? We're going to answer all of that through the story of the Sturmgeschütz and the crews who fought and died inside them. The StuG story begins back in the interwar years, when the German army began shaping a new way of warfare. What they wanted was a mobile, armored gun that could directly support infantry on the move. Traditional towed cannons couldn't keep pace with advancing troops, especially not for the kind of fast-paced warfare the Germans were envisioning. So, the idea of assault artillery started to take form. The initial requirements were that the vehicle be relatively low in height, not much taller than a standing soldier, and that it mount a short-barreled 75mm gun inside a fixed casemate rather than a rotating turret. For the chassis, the engineers used the already proven and reliable Panzer III. They added a superstructure on top to house the main gun. In these early stages, the StuG was placed under the command of the artillery branch, not the armored corps, and that made sense at the time, since these weren't tanks in the traditional sense. But this role would change dramatically over the course of the war as new threats emerged and the battlefield evolved. Still, one important detail was that the men who operated these vehicles were artillerymen. They were trained gunners, not tankers, and as you'll see later on, that mattered a lot. Roughly 30 of the first StuGs were ready in time to participate in the Battle of France in 1940. They were used effectively to knock out enemy pillboxes, bunkers, and fortified positions, exactly as they were intended. The concept worked, and the crews quickly appreciated its low profile. At just under 2 meters tall, it was difficult to spot, easy to conceal, and hard to hit, making it a strong candidate for ambush tactics. That quality would also become even more important later in the war. One major drawback was that whenever early StuGs encountered enemy tanks, their short-barreled, low-velocity howitzers were nearly useless. Still, that wasn't seen as a significant issue at the time because the vehicle hadn't been designed for tank combat in the first place. Over the next production runs, armor was gradually thickened, optics were improved, and a roof-mounted machine gun was added to provide much-needed defense against close-range infantry attacks that had already proven dangerous in early encounters. However, the biggest changes were still to come. When Operation Barbarossa began, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the StuG went back to its original role again, supporting infantry with close-range, high-explosive firepower. And once again, it did that job well. But soon, they encountered problems they had never faced before, at least not in such overwhelming numbers. Soviet tanks like the T-34 and the KV-1 came as a shock to German troops. For the time, both were heavily armored and carried powerful guns. Early German anti-tank weapons struggled to deal with them, and they were arriving in far greater numbers than anyone had anticipated. It is true that poor Soviet command and organization blunted their effectiveness early on, but the threat was undeniable, and the Germans needed an answer fast. One of those answers came in the form of a major StuG redesign. The short-barreled howitzer was replaced with a long-barreled 75mm anti-tank gun, which was essentially a modified version of the Pak-40, adjusted to fit the assault gun's casemate. These upgunned StuGs arrived just in time to face the increasing waves of T-34s and Soviet counterattacks, and from this point on, the StuG's role would never be the same. It had started as infantry support, but now it would become Germany's most important frontline tank destroyer. StuGs turned out to be ideally suited for defensive warfare, especially on the open fields of the Eastern Front. Their low silhouette allowed them to lie in ambush, hidden in terrain folds or among the ruins of villages, and decimate advancing Soviet tanks in the open, and in that role, they were terrifyingly effective. In the massive tank battles of 1943 and 1944, including the Battle of Kursk and the Soviet offensives that followed, the StuG III became one of the Wehrmacht's most valuable frontline weapons. German after-action reports noted just how effective they were. During the Kursk operations, for instance, StuG battalions claimed to have destroyed 423 enemy tanks, while losing only 8 vehicles of their own. That kind of kill-to-loss ratio wasn't typical for most German units at that stage of the war, but it became a recurring theme with the StuG. The reason for this was how the vehicle was used and who was using it. Ambush tactics played a huge part, so did the high-quality optics, but just as important were the men behind the gun. Remember, StuG crews came from the artillery branch. They weren't tankers by training, they were gunners, and their precision, discipline, and gunnery skill had a massive impact on battlefield performance. That's a big part of why they managed to destroy so many Soviet tanks, often under horrific conditions and massive waves of tank charges. The numbers are staggering. The StuG ended up destroying an estimated 30,000 Soviet tanks over the course of the war. That is more than any other German combat vehicle and more than any single Allied tank type. In other words, it became the most successful tank killer of the entire war. Some of the most successful German tank aces scored a significant portion of their kills in StuGs. Kurt Knispel, for example, the highest-scoring German tank ace who destroyed over 160 enemy tanks, had many of those achieved while fighting in a StuG. These vehicles were armed with the same long-barreled 75mm gun as the later Panzer IVs, but they often outperformed them. Better optics, better positioning, and better trained crews. When used in ambush, a StuG in the right hands was absolutely lethal. The StuG's 75mm high-velocity cannon could penetrate up to 90mm of armor at 500 meters, which was enough to destroy most Allied tanks, including the Sherman, Churchill, and even later model T-34s. By 1943, the StuG had evolved into a truly formidable fighting machine. It weighed about 24 tons and had solid mobility for its size and role. Frontal armor had been increased to 80mm, while additional armor plates were bolted onto the sides. Some crews even added concrete around the nose to increase protection. But in reality, those field modifications were usually more about boosting crew confidence than actually increasing protection in a meaningful way. However, one real vulnerability became apparent: the sides. Soviet anti-tank rifles, which were in huge numbers, could punch through the thinner side armor of German vehicles. This led to the widespread adoption of side skirts, so-called Schürzen, on the StuGs and many other German tanks. These thin metal plates were intended to destabilize the round before hitting the main armor, dramatically lowering its penetration potential. The roof armor on a StuG was only about 10mm thick, which left it dangerously exposed to top attack threats, whether from aircraft or from anti-tank rifles fired from buildings in urban areas. Both would become serious problems as the war dragged on. But that was part of the design trade-off. The StuG sacrificed all-around protection in favor of heavier frontal armor. It was built to take hits from the front because that's where it was expected to engage the enemy. After the Battle of Kursk, the German High Command took serious notice of the StuG's performance. As a result, German production priorities shifted even further toward turretless tank destroyers. They were cheaper, faster to produce, and more effective in the type of warfare Germany now found itself stuck in: desperate, defensive, and stretched thin. Existing Panzer III chassis were increasingly redirected towards StuG production. A new variant was created using the Panzer IV chassis, which became the Sturmgeschütz IV. And, as German losses mounted and the number of available tanks shrank, focus shifted toward these more efficient assault gun and tank hunter variants. The same principle was soon applied across other platforms. From the Panther tank came the Jagd Panther. From the Panzer IV chassis came the Jagd Panzer IV. From the Tiger II came the massive Jagd Tiger. There was even the Sturm Tiger, an experimental assault vehicle armed with a naval rocket launcher designed for close-quarters destruction. Although most of them were not very successful and were extremely expensive, heavy, and unreliable. Among all of them, the StuG remained one of the most cost-effective vehicles Germany ever built. A single StuG cost around 70,000 Reichsmarks. In comparison, a Panzer IV cost about 100,000, while a Tiger tank cost roughly 300,000. The math was simple. For every Tiger built, Germany could produce 4 StuGs. But with all of that said, you might still wonder, if the StuG was so effective, why did so many of them not survive the war? Well, the answer lies in how they were used. As the tide of the war turned, StuG units were pulled into one desperate defensive battle after another. They inflicted heavy losses on advancing Allied armor, but the outcome was usually the same. They held their ground until they were either destroyed or ran out of fuel or ammunition. When that happened, the crew had to abandon and sabotage the vehicle to prevent capture. Losses were also extreme because of how the units were deployed. StuG battalions were constantly rushed from one crisis point to another, trying to plug the gaps in Germany's collapsing front lines. That meant they saw the worst of the fighting repeatedly. In many cases, they were used as sacrificial units to cover the retreat of the main army. They became fire brigades for a burning front, and over time they were regarded more and more as disposable assets. To make matters worse, they were increasingly thrown into situations for which they were never designed. Many were sent into urban combat without infantry or tank support. Some were deployed with little to no coordination, and almost none had meaningful air cover, since Allied forces had mostly taken control of the skies. In these conditions, StuGs were highly vulnerable to flanking attacks, handheld anti-tank weapons, and being swarmed by significantly more numerous Allied tanks. And there was another dark aspect when the vehicle was actually hit. Unlike tanks with turrets, where the crew might be somewhat separated across compartments, the StuG's crew of 4 all sat together inside a single fighting compartment. So, when a penetrating hit came, it usually killed or wounded the entire crew at once. Later in the war, as Germany's manpower reserves dried up, replacement crews were poorly trained and nearly all demoralized. These fresh recruits were thrown into increasingly hopeless battles, often with minimal preparation and equipment. And finally, by the later stages of the war, the StuG, which was designed before the conflict even began, had logically become outdated, while Allied anti-tank weapons had advanced significantly. Out of the more than 10,000 StuGs produced during the war, only about 1,300 were still in service by 1945. So you can imagine how brutal their usage had become. Still, despite all of that, the StuG remains one of the most effective and practical fighting vehicles of World War II, and a unique solution that actually worked. It didn't get nearly the same attention as other famous German tanks and tank destroyers, but in terms of tank kills, battlefield utility, and wartime production, it was unmatched. Quietly, and without the fame, it is Germany's deadliest armored vehicle.